Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday, the 13th of April, 2021, and today's episode of Civil War Chat is General Lee was superior to General Grant. So just a note to encourage you, if you'd like to subscribe to this, click on the notification bell in the upper right, and then also the subscriber button down below me here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the narrative of Lee was superior to Grant. Although modern historians claim that Ulysses Grant was a better commander than Robert E. Lee, they are deluded by an anti-Confederate bias that has saturated every corner of academia during the last 40 years. The first and greatest test between their opposing armies lasted only 7 weeks, until Grant found himself stalemated by Lee's smaller army at Petersburg, Virginia. Since Grant attempted to march directly to Richmond instead of using the Federal Navy to bypass the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia with few casualties, as McClellan had done 2 years earlier, this campaign or conflict became known as the Overland Campaign. Despite an overall 2-to-1 numerical advantage, Northern eyewitness and historian William Swinton put Grant's casualties at 60,000 compared to only 20,000 for Lee. That's a 3-to-1 differential. At the end of the campaign, Grant's losses so demoralized his soldiers that they failed to entrap Richmond by severing its last railroad supply link at Petersburg, despite a 3-to-1 advantage on that battlefield at that time. In short, Grant so bloodied his men that they were too cowed or too scared to launch a lively attack at Petersburg, where they should have ended the war 9 months before Appomattox. Evidence of this is unequivocal. General George Meade, who commanded Grant's largest army, explained that the Petersburg attack failed due, quote, to the moral condition of the army, close quote. He added that if the same soldiers had made the attack with the spirit they showed at the start of the campaign, quote, we should have succeeded with half the loss we met. They should have succeeded on June 17th, 1864, of taking Petersburg and thereby essentially ending the war. But it was the morale of the Union Army which had been so damaged by Grant's butchery that it lacked the nerve. The campaign began at the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th, 1864, when Grant had about 124,000 soldiers as compared to only 66,000 for Lee. It ended on the 17th of June, stalemated at the Petersburg trenches. Since his casualties approximated about 10,000 per week, Grant thereby earned the epithet, quote, butcher, close quote. Now, contrary to the teachings of some modern historians like Ty Sedgley, for example, the moniker originated with Grant's own soldiers and Northern civilians, not Confederates or members of the so-called lost cause postbellum school of Civil War history. Losses for the two sides during the battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor correspond closely to the federal disasters at Second Bull Run, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg. Each one of those battles, even the most pro-Grant historian will admit, were disastrous Union defeats. Ulysses Grant had finally, quote, met, close quote, Lee, although not with the results he expected and those that were expected of him by his proponents. Each of his 4 maneuvers, passing through the wilderness to open country, reaching Spotsylvania first, crossing the North Anna, and flanking Lee at Cold Harbor, failed. All 4 failed. Each of his three major engagements ended in defeat. The stalemating of Grant constituted a major Confederate victory, which was reflected in Lincoln's acute concern about electoral defeat in the autumn elections of 1864. He even told his cabinet that he expected to lose that election. Partly, and if not largely, because Grant was stalemated. He had used his army's courage and depleted it. They could do nothing more in 1864. Lee ably dealt with a force nearly twice the size of his own. Grant never came close to his goal of bringing Lee's army into the open battlefield and beating it. In fact, Grant's massive losses in only 45 days during May and June destroyed the effectiveness of his army for the rest of the year. Notwithstanding the preceding analysis, Grant apologists eagerly seek excuses for his larger casualties. A common one is that the losses reflected Grant's role as the battlefield aggressor, whereas Lee's soldiers had the less vulnerable job of defending entrenched positions. That claim is false, and it is emphatically false and untrue at the first and biggest battle of the campaign in the Wilderness, where Lee was the aggressor, and Grant mostly reacted to Lee's thrust. Nonetheless, according to Lee's biographer, Douglas Freeman, Grant suffered 18,000 casualties and inflicted only 8,000 on Lee. After the war, General James H. Wilson, who commanded a cavalry division in Grant's army at the time, said that two of the commanders, meaning Grant's aides, told him, meaning Wilson, of a revealing incident at the end of the Battle of the Wilderness. Grant, they said, quote, went into his tent and throwing himself face downward on his cot gave way to the greatest emotion, close quote. Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was also on headquarters duty, told Wilson, quote, I never saw a man so agitated in my life, close quote. While it is permissible to doubt whether Grant collapsed into hysterics as reported because these remarks came after the war, even the general's acolytes among historians concede that he smoked about 20 cigars that day. So he wasn't really the cool cucumber that he is often portrayed by his proponents among the academic historians. At the next battle of Spotsylvania, Lee was mostly on the defensive, true, but he had to respond with a counterattack that was even more forceful than those of Grant's in the Wilderness. Next, at the North Anna River, Grant fell into a trap when he misunderstood Lee's deployment as a retreat. While hastily pursuing a phantom rebel army that he thought was retreating, Grant had unintentionally divided his own army, thereby inviting Lee to defeat it in detail. That is, by concentrating Lee's whole army on a component of Grant's and beating that one and then the next one, while being protected by the North Anna River from attack from the Union armies that were not involved in the attack in detail campaign. Fortunately for Grant, Lee became incapacitated by illness and could not spring the trap with an assault before Grant corrected his error. In other words, Lee got sick and he wanted to attack, but he couldn't do it because he was sick for 11 days of his 45 days. And it happened during the North Anna period. At last, on June the 1st, both sides attacked at different points along the Cold Harbor lines. Unfortunately for Grant, the battle is most remembered for his final assault on the 3rd of June, which cost him 7,000 casualties as compared to only 1,500 for Lee. Grant compounded his error by leaving his wounded soldiers in no man's land between the opposing entrenchments for 3 days. Few of the wounded fallen between the battle lines survived. Finally, after stalemated at Petersburg in June 1864, Grant fell victim to his sporadic alcoholism. Although dissatisfied with political general Benjamin Butler, whom he would dismiss 6 months later, Butler won a reprieve by threatening to disclose an incident involving Grant drunkenness. Grant visited Butler and a Butler subordinate named Baldy Smith, close quote, on June 29th, where he became intoxicated. While traveling from one post to another, Grant, quote, vomited all over his horse's neck and shoulders, close quote. Thereafter, Smith took a short leave. Expecting to replace Butler upon his return, Smith instead discovered that it was he who was to be sacked. After first assuring himself of President Lincoln's support, thereby neutralizing any further blackmail threat from Butler, Grant finally dismissed Butler on January 8, 1865, following the latter's mismanaged attack on Fort Fisher. Okay. For those of you that would like to learn more about Lee's brilliance, I recommend The Confederacy at Flood Tide, which covers the period from June 1862 to December 1862, when I believe the Confederacy had its best chance for winning independence. You can buy this book at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's $28. It's hardcover. If you would like to get an autographed copy, then email me, Phil, Phil _ Leigh, LEIGH, at me.com. And I will ship it to you free of charge, autographed. But the cost to you, including the postage, is $31 for that, as opposed to $28 at Barnes & Noble or Amazon or any fine bookstore. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.